Okay.
All right. So yes. So good evening, everyone. So thanks to all of you that are here live. We are recording this, and basically what we're thinking is for the course of this presentation, we are going to just work on the chat box function for any questions that you have, just so we can keep the presentation flowing. And then if we do get a chance at the end to cover some of those questions, we will. But I do think we do have quite a lot of information that we're probably going to bombard you with this evening. All for the greater good of your health and on your journey. So if we can't get round to answering those questions, then I will make a note of all of those, and then maybe do a bit of a Q&A live in the Wellbeing Through Wisdom Facebook group. So for those that don't know me, so I'm Kath, originally from South Africa. I am a registered dietitian, been living in England for the last, 8 years now. So I've always had a keen interest on holistic health, and that's why I have transitioned. I'm still working part-time for the NHS, but I've transitioned into my own business as well, just to make it a bit more well-rounded with regards to nutrition, mental health, and physical well-being. And tonight I'm here with David Griffiths, who is a biologist and specializes in nutrition and disease prevention. He is going to provide such valuable information tonight, just regarding the fact that our diet is such a key pillar of health. You know, having a good diet can actually prevent disease, but poor diet can actually be one of the key root causes of many of the health ailments and diseases we face in our modern world. So it's so great to have David with us, and just a little bit of background on him. I think I met David about a year ago at one of his free nutrition talks, and we just clicked straight away. We have such similar values and just resonating messages with regards to our concerns about our modern diet, about disease prevention, well, disease management, should I say, in modern healthcare. And we just really are in alignment. So it's just an honor to call David a friend and a mentor to me. But when he isn't showing off with his impressive push-ups, he's been doing that 25-day 25 push-up challenge in light of raising awareness for mental ill health. And yeah, I mean, some of the things he does is just, it's wizardry as far as I'm concerned. But alongside that and mesmerizing people with his nutrition knowledge, you know, he also activates his creativity by playing the piano beautifully, I must say, and teaching others to do the same. So he's extremely well-rounded individual, and a big inspiration as far as being in peak physical and mental health. So, you know, with all that being said, David, thank you so much for being here tonight to share with us some of your knowledge, particularly around such a key and important topic such as metabolic syndrome. And yeah, with that all being said, over to you. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Kath. And you're right about the resonance. I mean, that is definitely, I remember the talk where you were at, and you came up and just introduced yourself, and it was so refreshing to have someone sort of engaging, yeah, right from the start. And I know that you're sort of transitioning out of the NHS, you know, partly because of the information which you're going to hear tonight, and being a bit frustrated with the kind of information that you're told you're allowed to share, if you like. So I know you've had people aside saying, well, I'm not supposed to tell you this, but this is what you should do. And I think that's, yeah, that's really good. You've really educated yourself way beyond sort of what might be expected as in a normal dietitian. So it's really cool. So yeah, you'll see why this is so important, I think, as this topic unfolds tonight. I personally think it is probably the most important issue in healthcare. And you'll see why, because it encapsulates so many of the problems that we face in the 21st century. Metabolic syndrome is also called Syndrome X sometimes, and I'll show you why that is true later as well. But there is another thing called Syndrome X, which is a sort of rare genetic condition. So not to confuse the two. I mean, this is definitely a disease of metabolism, and I'm going to just pick that apart as we go through. So that was me, that's a few years back actually. But so you're welcome to always get in touch with me, and I'm sure as you're members of Kath's group, just feel free to just reach out to her, and we work closely together, so she can always pass on questions, but she knows all the answers anyway, to be honest. So when we're looking at our sort of human evolution, rising out of chimps and, Homo sapiens arriving a couple of million years ago, and where we've sort of reached the pinnacle of our evolution and our physiology actually goes back to those sort of times. It goes back to the time, well, our physiology goes back a few million years as humans, and it goes back much, much, much further on. Some of the reactions in the body, some of the sort of enzymatic reactions and things were actually happening in organisms over 1 billion years ago, like 1.3 billion years ago. So we've got this physiology which has been kind of adapting to our environment and perfecting itself over the course of millions, if not 1 billion or more years. And I just want you to sort of just think about how quickly we have changed our world. I mean, we've all grown up. I've grown up since the 60s, and the world has changed very, very much, even since I was a child. But if you go back another couple of 100 years before that, sort of reminds me of that Fast Show character, or Harry Enfield character, when he says, "I remember this when it was all just fields." But it wasn't that long ago when that was true. And we've now kind of, instead of living, let's say, in harmony with the planet, we've now dominated the planet. And we've also changed our diet out of all proportion, sort of alongside that. So the guy on the right you see there, unfortunately, that's a lot of us in the 21st century. And physiologically, what we're doing to our bodies, our physiology doesn't respond very well to the way we live our life in the 21st century. So I'll just sort of go through how quickly we've changed things. So going back to sort of, as a species, we've been around a couple of million years. And what we were doing then was basically, we were in sync with the planet, we're in sync with nature, we're hunting our own food, we have to run after it, we have to climb trees to get it, or pick bushes, or work our way through scrub to get things. And the main problem back then was getting enough food. And we're in a situation now in the 21st century where our main problem for most people is having too much food, actually. So just going back 500 generations ago, the Fertile Crescent, we learned how to grow wheat and domesticate cattle, and we started to become an agricultural kind of population. And that meant the rise of population, and we could group people into towns and cities, and we could make war on other people, and the population starting to explode. But we're still having to work quite hard. If we might be growing wheat, but to grind that wheat was a very labor intensive process. So it would require a lot of muscle power to do that, and a lot of calorific expenditure to do that. And then just a couple of 100 years ago, it's not very long at all, just a couple 100 years, when we invented big machines, and we worked out how to get all this energy out of food very, very efficiently. So now making flour, which was a huge labor intensive process, we just stick it in a big machine, and out the other end comes finely milled flour. So not that long ago, and just since perhaps my grandparents' generation, we've started to think we get very clever with our chemistry. And just to put this in some kind of perspective, like margarine, for example, didn't exist. That was the Crisco company, 1911. So we're going back just 100 years, and we start mucking around with vegetable oils and think we can improve them, and we start sort of arguing the case against butter and lard and tallow and suet and all the things that we used to use in our cooking and that work very, very well, and think we can, basically it's economics, it's economic scale. So we can produce margarine cheaper than we can sort of get tallow and suet and stuff like that. So that's one example with the oils, but we've basically changed all our foodstuffs, and we've started to invent foods. So now we've got a situation where we've got something like 600,000 processed food choices, and they're just so easy to get. You walk into any corner shop and it's like a plastic extravaganza, isn't it? So you've got 200 flavors of crisps, and you've got loads of chocolate in shiny wrappers, and we've got all of that kind of stuff just presented to us all the time. And we might think, oh, I eat a balanced diet, but yeah, I snack on these things from time to time. Now, actually, in the UK, 50.7%, i.e. just over half of our diet, comes from ultra high processed foods. So when we say we eat a balanced diet, actually half of our diet did not even exist 50 or 60 years ago. It's just astonishing, really. So how do our bodies adapt to that? And the answer is not very well. Evolution takes hundreds of thousands or millions of years to make a dent, usually, or to make some sort of change. And we've tried to change everything in a couple of generations, and it just doesn't work. So the result of that are things like metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is basically, yeah, it's a twofold problem. It's a problem of having too many calories, but it's also a problem, or it's a hormonal problem. And I want to sort of just discuss that and explain that a bit further. So this is just to explain, before we get into that, how powerful hormones are. And when, I've seen lots of advice from, let's say, personal trainers, just do more exercise and eat less. It's the sort of standard message, isn't it? But this woman here on the left-hand side, she has a problem with, or had a problem with, a hormone called cortisol. It was a tumor that caused that problem. And when that tumor was removed, the lady on the right-hand side is the same lady. Now, she didn't get any advice on diet and exercise. She just had this problem with basically cortisol. So that's, that stress makes you put on weight, and that is right. That's one of the things that cortisol does, is it has a sort of fat accumulation property. So that's cortisol. The next one is a little guy who had a problem with leptin, which is another hormone, which is basically a satiety hormone. So it tells your brain when you are full. The problem is, if you're leptin resistant, or that programming doesn't work properly, then your brain doesn't get the message. So although this little guy who's 3 on the left-hand side is obviously full, his brain doesn't think so. So he just keeps eating. So he's at the mercy of that hormonal problem. And on the right is the same guy at age 7, and now he's normal weight, and he actually weighs less on the right, but he's normal age and weight for his height. So that's just by correcting that thing. And leptin actually is a big part of metabolic syndrome. I'm not going to go into it tonight because it's basically a bit more complicated, and the granddaddy of all this basically is a hormone called insulin. So and that's very well understood. The leptin thing is a bit more recent, but anyway, I won't go into that too much. So the only other examples I think of bodybuilders taking steroid hormones, and growing to twice the size they normally are, or the contraceptive pill, that's another hormonal intervention. They have profound effects on our body. So what is metabolic syndrome? Is basically, I'm going to talk about that, but I will just give you a little bit of history, because it's still recent. It was a professor called Gerald Raven, who was working at Stanford University, only put this together and sort of joined all the dots about this in 1989. So that's the first time it's published in the medical literature, and then sort of popular textbooks on it started coming out in about the year 2000. And I've been involved in nutrition, well, basically since about 1998, and it was about that time, sort of 2000 or so, where I first came across this and just thought, wow, this is amazing information. So we're going to talk about how it's recognized, what the causes are, what the consequences of not doing anything about it, what we can do about it. That's the good news at the end, because I'm going to depress you for most of the talk. But the good news is that our actions and our habits have a profound effect on whether we get this thing and suffer from it, or how much we suffer from it. And then we'll give you some more resources at the end. But as you're in Kath's group, we're the resources as well. So please reach out to us sort of whenever you like, and we'll help you. So when we're talking about any health condition, the medical profession talks about the frailty continuum, or the health continuum, where we're looking at starting off in good health and then gradually developing a relative sort of morbidity or a problem. So this might be a little bit of knee pain, which then turns into arthritis, which then requires surgery or other intervention. And there's basically a continuum, if you look at any disease, from good health to dying. And at every point in that, the further that goes along that line, the less we can intervene, really. But we can always move left or right along that line, in my opinion. We can always do something to correct our health and put it on the right path. So we're talking in metabolic syndrome largely about blood sugar, and I'm sure that a lot of you will be aware of the glycemic index, which is basically how quickly a food turns into sugar in your body. Now, there's also a thing called the glycemic load. So glycemic index of rice is really, really high, but if you eat 1 grain of rice, it's not going to upset your insulin metabolism. So it's about the load of carbohydrates and the load of, it's called insulinogenic foods, so things that raise your insulin, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, because things like steak do that as well, so we'll talk about that. So as we go through this continuum, what I've put there is how do you start your day. So if you start your day the way that we've kind of been told, and this goes back to the work of Ansel Keys and other scientists back in the 60s, and this, we got very fat phobic, and we were told, or this is what Ansel Keys was spouting, and there's a lot of big industry involved in this as well, but the conventional wisdom has been for the last 50 years or so that we should make carbohydrates the majority. That's where we start out. So we've got a big sort of carbohydrate load, and we have a little bit of protein, and we don't have any fat, because that's the dangerous stuff. And actually we're now realizing, or we have realized, that the resulting rise in diabetes, obesity, high cholesterol, etc., is really a result of that government advice. So I'm going to say, you know, the kind of information you'll hear today, I would say it's at the cutting edge of information that should be shared. Governments respond very, very slowly to, you imagine how long it takes. Like I said with that Gerald Raven, he's writing in a medical textbook or medical papers in 1989, but it doesn't reach a textbook for 10 years. And the same is true of fructose metabolism. So the first time fructose, so fruit sugar, everyone thinks, oh yeah, I should eat lots of fruit, but actually you'll find out tonight that's a really, really dangerous thing to do. But that mechanism wasn't described in medicine until the year 2010. So we're kind of at the cutting edge, really, and consequently a lot of that information hasn't even made its way into kind of even medical textbooks and university textbooks, because it's too new. So if you're using a textbook that's 7 or 8 years old, you're out of date. Anyway, that was a bit of I went off a tangent, but I think it's really relevant. So what we've been told, how we start our day for ages, carb bias. So we eat, let's say, some cereals like Crunchy Nut cornflakes and a couple of bits of toast and a glass of orange juice, and that's our breakfast. Now, what we've done, if we do that, we're basically following this red curve on the diagram. We're raising our blood sugar very quickly, and that is an emergency situation. If our blood sugar goes too high, it's toxic, and if there's nothing to rein that in, we die from that. So we have a hormone called insulin, which controls that, and it brings our blood sugar back down. But it's kind of an emergency hormone, because finding that situation in nature, again, you could not eat that kind of carb load in one go in nature. So this emergency hormone brings our blood sugar back down, and you'll see this thing where it says uncontrollable hunger at the bottom. And what's happening there is we're releasing cortisol and we're releasing adrenaline. So we've got kind of stress hormones, and the adrenaline gives us energy to go and try and look for some more food. But of course, in the 21st century, looking for more food means the fridge, and it's only about 4 feet away from where we are at any one time. So we're on this kind of roller coaster ride of triggering blood sugar, it goes too low, we get kind of hangry, so we get hungry and angry, and we look for more of it, and we're back on this roller coaster causing insulin spikes and adrenaline spikes all through the day. So what we want to be doing is actually, I've put, well, this is an old slide actually, it says good carbs there, but actually much better than that is to have things like fat and protein as the way that you start your day, because that won't trigger insulin anything like the red thing, and it keeps our blood sugar in a very nice range. So just to go along this, what happens if you look at those blue boxes at the bottom? And basically, if you're hungry, you seek out food. Your food then raises your blood glucose. We have insulin to bring that blood glucose back down. Now, what happens if we're stimulating that all the time is that we get less sensitive to our insulin, and we need to make more of it to do the same job. So because of that, we're developing insulin resistance. It's not as efficient a system. Our insulin starts to go up. And if you go to medical school, then quite often what's insulin, or how is insulin described? It's described as a blood sugar regulating hormone. Actually, it's not that at all, really. It is a fat storage hormone, and it's there for a very good reason. It's there for, if you go back again into Paleolithic times and you're in July, August, September, you want to be stuffing as much carbohydrates, or as many carbohydrates in as possible, from blackberry bushes and crab apples and whatever you can find, and you want to make yourself as fat as possible, because if you don't, there's nothing to eat for a long time. It's going to be very, very difficult. You've got to catch rabbits or try and catch deer, or hope your fishing skills are up to scratch. Otherwise, you're not alive in January. So it's there to protect us and keep us alive, basically. But in the 21st century, it's irrelevant. That argument is irrelevant, because we've always got food and we're continually stimulating our insulin. So eventually this leads to poor glucose control, metabolic syndrome, diabetes. And if you've got diabetes, you're then at an increased risk of everything. And even before that, in a pre-diabetic state, let's say for every 3 chronological years you're alive, you're aging 4 years, because kind of there's free radical damage and inflammation sort of ravaging the system. So you're basically aging fast. So at the moment I'm scaring you, but at the end we're going to tell you what you can do about it. So this insulin response, a lot of people think it is just carbohydrates, but actually insulin is produced in response to all kinds of food. It's just that you can see there the carbohydrates take the lion's share of that. So they stimulate insulin much more. And for instance, with protein, if you eat a pound of steak, it gets converted into glucose actually through a process called gluconeogenesis. We won't go into that, but it also has an insulinogenic response. So I don't want you to think it's just carbohydrate, but obviously the modern thinking on this is really, it's around insulin. It's not around calories. So although fat has more calories, if you eat mostly sort of fat and protein and lots of leafy green vegetables, that kind of becomes the perfect diet, where you're not stimulating insulin much, and you're also getting a diet rich in antioxidants and minerals and phytonutrients. And a lot of when people think of carbs, they think of bread, rice, pasta, potato. Most of these things haven't been part of the diet until very recently, really, certainly for many cultures. So here's what insulin is. And again, this is the work of Gerald Raven sort of putting all this together. Insulin resistance is at the center of all the things that cause problems. And if you have 3 out of 5 of these things, your doctor will diagnose you with insulin resistance, with metabolic syndrome. So central abdominal obesity, low HDL cholesterol, and that's the cholesterol that we think of, well, that's a good thing. I won't go into cholesterol too much tonight because it's a very complex subject, but there's no real bad and good cholesterol. It's just moving substances around the body. But anyway, low HDL cholesterol, fasting glucose is raising, triglycerides are raising, which is the fat in the blood, and it's a storage form of fat, and blood pressure, hypertension going up as well. So these are the kind of markers of syndrome X and insulin resistance. What you'll notice on that, or not notice on that, is LDL cholesterol. And that's the one we think, oh, that's the really dangerous stuff, isn't it? But actually, interestingly enough, it doesn't even figure on this. And the jury is completely out on LDL cholesterol. I think there's certainly no, in fact, I'll probably say later, but I think cholesterol I'll say it now, is an absolutely vital molecule. So you need cholesterol. A lot of your brain is made of, 60% of your brain is made of fat. A lot of that is cholesterol. Your 30% of your cell membranes, the 37 trillion cells that we've got in our body all have a membrane. and 30% of that is cholesterol. We need it for sex hormones, we need it to make vitamin D, we need it to make bile acids, and without it you die. It's an absolutely vital molecule. And I've put there gerontology of the norm because kind of we expect as we get older, oh, I'm putting on a little bit of weight, or I've been to the doctor, he says, oh, my cholesterol's up a bit, I've got to go on a statin, or your blood pressure goes up. We kind of expect it to happen, but actually there's no reason why that should happen if we engage in the right lifestyle practices and dietary practices. So at the beginning of this sort of insulin resistance, I won't go through all of these, but you might be feeling a bit tired, emotional eating, you might want to be eating at night. You've got some metabolic markers like your HDL cholesterol is going down, triglycerides are going up, and we may be starting to put on a bit of weight. So we sort of got these beginning clues that maybe something is going wrong. And then metabolic syndrome would be, as I said, that would be diagnosed by your doctor if you've got 3 or more of the following, which just goes back to that X diagram that I put up before. So blood pressure, obesity, triglycerides, HDL cholesterol, and fasting blood glucose. And then if you don't do anything about it and you keep engaging in those practices that have got you there, you're moving forward towards diabetes type 2. So as I put there, it is not just an inconvenience. And if you want to get really scared, have a look what happens once you're diagnosed with diabetes. So you've already got advanced cardiovascular disease, very likely, and it's the leading cause of blindness. This is because sugar basically accumulates in the eye, and it accumulates in the kidneys, and it accumulates in the nerves, and diabetes is therefore the leading cause of things like kidney failure and amputation. And we get this sort of the tissues of the body start to die, so we get these sort of horrible diabetic foot ulcers and things going on. So but the good news, as I keep saying, is we can do something about this at every stage actually, but we have to take action to do it, and we have to get a little bit educated to do it. So just going to look at the things from the X diagram and just explain them a little more. And sorry, this is a little bit medical, but bear with me and I'll try and sort of make it as clear as possible. But I just want to show you really clearly this link. So if you look at that graph there, basically as our fasting insulin goes up, we get fatter. And there's a very, very clear link between our levels of insulin and our body fats. So that's number one. How does that happen? Basically, when we're born with fat cells. After about the age of 2, you don't really make more fat cells, but you can make those fat cells bigger. And that's how we get fatter. So the reason behind this is basically we've got these triglycerides on the left running around in the body. And to store them in a cell, in a fat cell, they won't go in. They're too big to go through the doors. And we've got this LPL, which is lipoprotein lipase. It basically snips that triglyceride molecule up into things which are small enough to let it into the cell. So if you've got excess insulin, this LPL is turned on, and it allows fat to enter the cell to be stored. And you'll notice at the top you've got glucose, so it also opens this gate for glucose to go in. And those two things then recombine to form triglyceride within the cell. So that's like a double whammy so far of problem, that you've now got a fat storage mechanism going on. And as I said, that's great if you're a Paleolithic man in September, but it's not great for us when we've got calories around us 24/7. The other thing that this does is it switches off for this enzyme called hormone sensitive lipase, which does the opposite. And it's the thing that allows us to burn fat and snip the molecules back up and let them out of the cell. And it contributes then it enables us to burn our fat for energy and keep our weight down. So insulin has a very obvious effect there. And if you don't believe me, then you can see how intimately insulin is associated with fat cell size increase, because these are people who are injecting insulin. These are diabetics injecting insulin, and they habitually inject into the same sites. And in those sites, you can see that those sites are just swollen with fat, and that's because they're injecting insulin around there. So any argument that insulin is a fat storage hormone, there is no argument, basically. It's very, very clear. For most of us, that's happening all over our body. For these people, it's now happening primarily in a localized area. So secondly, high blood pressure, and again, really clear the way that if you've got if you start to inject insulin, basically your blood pressure goes up, and you can see there it's gone up by sort of after just a few weeks, or even a couple of weeks, it's gone up by 7 or 8 points. So it's quite a significant rise just from having a higher insulin. And this happens in a number of ways. This is one. So when you've got a fatty liver, this fatty liver is basically, I'll just rewind a second. When you eat glucose, let's say you're 160 pounds, you've got 160 pounds of your body and your body's cells that can use glucose. So all these cells can process glucose. If you eat fructose, which again, we've been told, oh, that's the good stuff, that's fruit sugar, that only gets metabolized by the liver. So instead of having 160 pounds of us to metabolize that, we've got a 5-pound liver trying to metabolize all of that fructose. And when that liver gets overwhelmed, it starts to become fatty, and it produces more uric acid, and that uric acid stops the production or inhibits nitric oxide production. There's other things going on there, but basically nitric oxide works in a few ways. It works in the brain, and it works to allow our white blood cells to function well, so our immune response. And it also, in this particular context, we're talking about blood vessels and whether they are elastic or not. So that's what nitric oxide is, allowing our blood vessels to kind of expand and contract. And if that's not happening, then the blood pressure goes up because of that sort of that damage to the blood vessel. The other thing that happens is that it helps our body to withdraw salt back out of the kidneys. And there's a principle in science which is basically that fluid follows salt. So if you're taking salt back out of the kidney tubules, out of the kidneys and back into the circulation, then fluid is going to follow that. Water is going to follow that. And if you've got more fluid in your blood, also your blood pressure is going to go up as a direct consequence of that. That's very obvious. But it's something, again, that I think not many doctors know about this unless they're kind of kidney specialists, in which case they know all about the action of insulin on the kidneys, but it's not a very well-known mechanism. And you can see actually this reference is only from 5 years ago. So it's, again, sort of hasn't made its way into conventional medical training, really. So while we're on salt, I just wanted to mention this because salt is something that scares a lot of people. Personally, I use quite a lot of salt, but I use really nice sort of pink Himalayan salt because it's got loads of different minerals in it. But this is a really interesting paper. This is from the New England Journal of Medicine, which is probably the most prestigious medical journal in the world. And it's a very big study. And it was looking at what happens if you put salt in your diet. And you'll see here that there's a kind of sweet spot for the amount of sodium that's in your diet. Now, this is looking at sodium excretion. So if you've excreted it, you've obviously taken it in. And salt is usually sodium chloride. And this 4 grams or so a day of sodium would mean about 10 grams of sodium chloride. So about 10 grams of salt to maybe 15 grams of salt is a kind of sweet spot for your risk of dying from anything. And you'll notice if you have more than that, your risk goes up on a quite shallow curve. So if you double that, your risk has only gone up by about 20%. If you halve it, you're in big trouble, as you can see, because that curve going backwards is really bad. So I just wanted to draw your attention to that because it's something that people do sort of say, oh, I never put salt on my food. I'm actually saying that's probably not a good thing, unless you're hypertensive already. So next thing, blood triglycerides. So the fat going around in the blood. And it's obvious here from healthy subjects and people with diabetes, their blood triglycerides are higher. And this is quite an interesting little experiment. Sorry, this is getting a little bit medical, but I'll come out of this section in a sec. This was a study where they basically fed people carbohydrates. So where it says like these stepwise carbohydrate overfeeding. So they're beginning to feed people carbohydrates. And at first, those carbohydrates can be stored in the liver as glycogen. but you see by about day 5, you can't store anymore. It's like you've filled the liver up. It can't take any more carbohydrates. It can't process any more carbohydrates. And that word lipogenesis there is the production of new fat. So the liver is starting to make fat and starting to become fatty liver, maybe non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, but it's happening not in response to eating fat. It's happening in a response to eating carbohydrate. And that's the important thing to ram home. This is a disease basically, it's around insulin, but it's happening because of excess carbohydrate. And this fatty liver, then on the right-hand side of this, is sort of chucking out loads of triglycerides. They're swallowed up by these HDL cholesterol particles and they're taken around the body. And the interesting thing is that they get overstuffed and those HDL particles kind of burst, and means that your HDL is then going down and your triglycerides are released into the system, so they're going up. And one of the clearest signs of whether you're in trouble with this disease is your ratio of triglycerides to HDL. So anyway, I won't go too much more into that. So it also sort of manifests out, or insulin resistance manifests itself on quite a lot of skin conditions. So these skin tags here, again, if you go to the doctor with a skin tag, I think the usual response would be, well, I don't know why you've got them, but I can burn them off for you. It's not a problem. But actually, they're there because you're insulin insensitive. Basically, you've got insulin resistance. And this other skin condition is called acanthosis nigricans. It's basically a blackening of the skin, usually in the folds, under the armpit, on the neck, anywhere where you've got sort of the folded skin. And I was just saying to my friend the other day, because it's also in the back of the hand. So I think I remember as a teenager noticing this kind of pigmentation on the back of my knuckles. And it's not because I was just specifically overweight, but teenagers go through a period of insulin resistance when you're a teenager, which is why you get that sort of puppy fat that kind of quite often goes away, or you also get this sort of other skin problems that usually clear up as you get older. So it's down to the action of insulin. So I just want to show you what happens when we eat like we're supposed to eat, like we've evolved to eat. So this is, really like this study. This particular one's from Australia, but it's looking at if people eat, how they've evolved to eat. And this was with a diabetic community. So these Aboriginal diabetics. So these Aborigines had moved to the cities, and they basically they were eating in a 20th century developed world way. And what had happened to them was they developed diabetes. So their body mass index was high. On the left, you can see that. Their fasting glucose was high. Their triglycerides were high. They had all the markers of metabolic syndrome, and they'd gone beyond that. They're actually diabetic. So what they did was these people is they put them back in their community. And you probably know what Aborigines eat. I mean, they hunt kangaroos. They really value witchetty grubs. Those, and I can't imagine ever eating one, but these witchetty grubs are a delicacy to them. They're 67% fat, these witchetty grubs. So they went back to their community and they started eating that way. And what happened with their diabetes, that 11.6 blood glucose went down to 6.6. This is a 7-week trial, by the way. So in 7 weeks, they're basically very close to normalizing their blood glucose. You can see this drastic fall in weight. This is about 8 kilos over 7 weeks. And that's just from abandoning McDonald's and sandwiches and all the sort of fast food stuff that they're eating in the cities, and going back to hunting kangaroos and eating fat and sugar and maybe, I don't know, doing some fishing and eating those witchetty grubs. But basically, that's what's happening to their metabolism. It's just correcting back to normal. And you can see here, so this traditional indigenous diet, so what they're eating is actually very close to the diet on the right, which is now becoming sort of, I'd say, the healthy way to eat. So it's a low carbohydrate, high fat, moderate protein diet. And what we're still saying in, partly why Kath got so frustrated in working for the NHS, because the NHS, and same in America, same in Australia, obviously here, they're saying limit fat, limit saturated fat, limit cholesterol, and they're the stuff to be scared of. I'm going to say that it's absolutely not true, and I'm going to give you some evidence for that as well. So when we're looking at all these markers of metabolic syndrome, sorry, I'm still in kind of medical world, but this is, I'm just going to make this really clear. That big diamond you can see down the bottom right there, that's kind of the accumulation of all of these studies, and this is a huge meta-analysis. This is absolutely at the pointy end of medical research. It doesn't get any better than these kind of meta-analyses. So you can see here that when you have a low-carb diet, basically people lose weight. Next thing, oh sorry, I'll just expand on that. So there have been 62 studies on comparing low carb versus low fat in from 2003 to 2018. Of those, half of them weren't statistically significant. Of the ones that were, in every case, the low carbohydrate diet was the more successful. So pretty clear, and they're the blue bars there. So HDL, we want that to be high, and if you look right at the bottom of that, you'll see that it raises HDL if we're on a low carbohydrate diet. We reduce triglycerides, we reduce blood pressure. These are all, this is basically, as I said, the best medical research out there, and we reduce blood glucose. So everything that's associated with insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome, and consequently from that, diabetes and the increased risk of heart disease, increased risk of cancers, increased risk of arthritis, everything you can name goes the right way if we're on a low carbohydrate diet. And I just want to explain how sort of modern medicine tackles this, or actually fails to tackle it, because with many of these things, I put up that that health continuum at the start, near the start. And these diseases that we suffer from, if you look at things like osteoporosis, we can trace the beginnings of osteoporosis into adolescence, and we can trace the beginnings of heart disease into childhood. So all of these diseases, they're not diseases, they're not like flu, and they're not diphtheria, they're not cholera or typhoid. They're not things we catch, they are things that develop within us. And we've still got this kind of ancient paradigm about, oh, I caught cancer. I've heard this said. It's just, we don't do that. We grow them. So when we're looking at insulin resistance, I'm just going to take you through this. So this is looking at, if you're perfectly healthy, and I've got to say thanks to Dr. Paul Mason in Australia, because he's, these are his results from his clinic. So he's a great guy. So normal insulin sensitivity, you go to doctor, maybe you're 35 years old, your doctor checks your glucose, your blood glucose, and he gives you a glucose tolerance test, and you come out of that, it's 4.4, and he said, congratulations, that's absolutely textbook, you are in perfect health, go home. Now that's the blue square. What he doesn't do, because the NHS do not do this because it's expensive, they don't test your insulin level. So you'll notice that 10 in the red box on the right is insulin level. And then if we go forward maybe 10 or 15 years, 10 years, go back to the doctor, and he measures your glucose again, and it says 5.6. You go, oh, well done. It's gone up a little bit, but well done. Yeah, I'd still say you're pretty healthy. So you can clean bill of health, you can go home again. Look what's happened to the red square. So it's gone from 10 to 83. So it was that, it is now that, 83. So what's happening now is that mechanism that you've got, your pancreas churning out insulin, is now churning out 8 times as much insulin. It's having to work 8 times as hard to control your blood glucose. And it's still doing a really good job, isn't it? Because your doctor's told you you're healthy. But remember, you haven't been tested for insulin. Wind this forward another 5 years or so, and now you take that glucose tolerance test. Oh, well, it's a little bit high. Now the advice, the conventional medical advice now would be, well, maybe go for a run every so often, do a bit of aerobic exercise. Now I'm going to tell you that aerobic exercise does not do as much as weight training or resistance training or high intensity interval training in this regard. There's some good things about it, but if you want to do something about insulin resistance, you basically need more muscle, because your muscle is the engine where your fat is burned. So it turns you from a 1 litre engine person to a 2 litre engine person, let's say, if you've got more muscle mass. So going back to this, we've now got a bit of a problem with glucose. The doctor said, oh, eat lots of salad and get on the treadmill and avoid the fat, avoid saturated fat, whatever you do. And it's actually exactly the wrong advice. But look at the insulin now; it's basically topping out. So it's 117. Your pancreas can't work any harder. And if we go forward, this still hasn't been measured, by the way. Go forward, it has been measured in Paul Mason's clinic because he's educated about this stuff. But if we wind forward, you now go to the doctor and he takes your blood glucose and it's 11, and he goes, "Oh, I'm really sorry to tell you, but you're diabetic, and now I'm going to prescribe some medication for you." So, but look what's happened to the insulin. It's actually your pancreas is kind of giving up, and your pancreas can always recover to some extent, as long as this hasn't gone too far. But the irony of this situation is that the excess sugar in your blood could create so many free radicals and so much oxidative damage that it's actually destroying the beta cells in the pancreas where the insulin is produced. So it's like sabotaging its own system. But of course, in nature, you'd never have to deal with this, because you'd never get this situation. It's only in the 20th and 21st century where we really had a problem with this. So that's the bad news. But the good news is that basically the root causes of all of this stuff are diet and lifestyle, as you've obviously picked up by now. So diet high in refined foods, low in essential nutrients, inactive lifestyle, emotional well-being, really important, but all these things are challenged. All of those things are challenged with our modern lifestyle. So if we go back to Paleolithic times again, we were catching, I won't go into all this, but you know how Stone Age man must have eaten. They had to catch their food. They didn't cook a lot of it. They're eating a lot of fish. They're eating animals when they can catch them. There were lots of plants. There's no fruit to speak of. There's certainly no bread trees or anything like that. So we're getting a lot of fiber, and I'll just go into that a little bit. So I'll go through that. I've just mentioned that one thing at the bottom where it says studies show 30% more calories consumed. That's in reference to well, there have been some studies done where they give an equal calorie breakfast to teenagers, but the breakfast is either kind of cereals and toast, or it's a high fat, moderate protein breakfast. And they then said to these teenagers, they gave them the same amount of breakfast, and then they said, just eat whatever you like the rest of the day. And the teenagers who ate the sort of cereals and toast then consumed 30% more calories, because they were on that blood sugar roller coaster all day, feeling hungry, triggering insulin, feeling hungry, triggering insulin. And that's what's happening. And that's a really clear indication, I think, of something going wrong there. So the balanced diet, do we eat a balanced diet? Well, if we're eating 50% of our food as processed food, and most of the foods we wouldn't have existed in nature a couple of 100 years ago, then no, it can't be that way. We can try, and we can try as hard as we can, but our food supply is massively adulterated. So our proteins and fats and carbohydrates have all changed as well. So even though we think we're doing as well as we can, we have changed what we're eating. So this is what Kath is supposed to recommend, the Eat Well plate. So you can see on the right this big third. So eat loads of bread and rice and potatoes and pasta and starch. And I'm going to say, well, you'll realize by now this is probably well outdated advice on what we should be doing. So if we compare the way that we've evolved with the way we eat now, just take a couple of these things. So you can see fruit consumption, we eat much, much more fruit now. Fiber, much, much lower. And we're eating in many more processed foods and much more grains than we did. So everything's changed there. Protein consumption, we were eating lots of fish and shellfish, so getting that would bring omega-3s with it, lots of really good fats and things as well. And then if we go to the fat consumption, yeah, some really clear, well, I think the thing to pick out from that is really, you know, refined oils. We've started mucking around with oils, obviously, and margarines and things like that. And you know, whenever we eat crisps and biscuits, we've got terrible refined oils in there, and cakes and all of those things. And if you go out to eat, you've got the same problem. You know, what is the restaurant frying your food in? So the big thing there is the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3s. So omega-6s, we need both, but omega-6s are basically, they create an inflammatory response or more inflammatory response in the body. Omega-3s create an anti-inflammatory response. And we want to be aiming for a kind of 2-to-1 kind of ratio. But as you'll see on the right, I think the average in the UK is something like 18-to-1, and it's probably getting worse all the time. So I've seen people with even 100-to-1 ratio of omega-6 to 3s. So they're in a massively inflamed state. And every disease that we know about has a massive inflammatory component. So we want to be addressing that as much as we can. Micronutrients, we get a lot less than our Paleolithic ancestors did. So about a quarter of the vitamin C. That vitamin E is probably out of date. We only get about 3 to 4 international units, so maybe a seventh of what they were getting. And the thing down the bottom, the phytonutrients, all those eat the rainbow, colourful chemicals that are, we know can protect you against things like cancer, we're only getting maybe a tenth of what our Stone Age ancestors ate. And basically, the thing to remember there is leafy green vegetables, which is pretty much all they had in terms of vegetation, like about 200 plant species that all look like kale. But that is how you get your phytonutrients, is leafy green vegetables. They win hands down all over the place. This is obvious as well, and in our current situation, it's perhaps been made even worse. You know, we are sitting around a lot, we're watching TV, that's a modern invention, isn't it? We've got all these labor-saving devices, so we're not having to work as hard, basically. And if we want to stay fit and healthy, we actually have to make a point of doing it. We don't have to go out for a run to catch something, but it's a good idea to go out for a run. So we have to actually incorporate that into our lives. So the bad news is we're all going on more bad news. We're all going in the wrong direction. So I've been giving this talk for nearly 20 years, but I remember in 2005 when I was putting up how many million people in the UK were diabetic, it was 1.4 million, and now 3.8. And you can see nearly a third of children born 20 years ago as adults, which is sort of coming now. At some point in their life, they will be diabetic. I mean, that really, really scary statistics, the rise in overweight and obesity and diabetes that goes with that. So what's the conventional approach to this is basically to address diseases with a pharmaceutical intervention. And I'm going to make a big argument that this is a disease of lifestyle and nutrition and exercise. It is not a disease caused by a lack of medication. And the big guys, the big epidemiologists at Harvard, people like Walter Willett, who's probably the most famous one, he reckons that type 2 diabetes is something like 97% lifestyle. In other words, it's not the genes you're born with, it's not because your mum had it, it's because of the way you live. It's basically that and what you eat. It's down to that. So I'm going to say, I should have said at the beginning, this does not constitute medical advice. And if you're on medication, then you have to inform your doctor if you want to do something about it or chat about it. But all the drugs used in this have side effects. We use statins to lower cholesterol. We've got various things to lower blood pressure. We've got other things. I mean, some of those things down here, phentermine and fenfluramine, it's banned now, but it's a weight loss drug that caused irreversible damage to heart valves. So yeah, we've got liver disease caused by diabetic drugs. Metformin is one of the, that's the more reliable diabetic medication. It's got a long track record. It's got a few problems, but nothing compared with some of the more modern things. So why do the more modern things exist? Because the patent on metformin has run out, so drug companies can't charge as much for it. So they're going to be trying to persuade the doctors, oh, you want to try this new one, it's much better, when actually it's not got the same safety record. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of these things and really scare you. So beta blockers. So European doctors may have caused as many as 800,000 deaths in 5 years following a guideline to use beta blockers like atenolol up there in non-cardiac surgery patients. So I won't go into big details here. This guy here is the chairman of a company called Valiant Pharmaceuticals, and he says basically we're in business to make money, and it's not about helping the sick, it's about helping our shareholders to make loads of money. Now he's being honest, I would say, and if you want to take that a bit further, I'd get hold of a book called Food is Better Medicine Than Drugs by Patrick Holford. Absolutely amazing, amazing, eye-opening book. So let's come on to statins. And now 2020, if it hasn't already, the statin industry will have turned over by 2020 $1 trillion. That's quite a lot of money. It's a very, very profitable industry. And I've heard people go to the doctor and, you know, especially if you've had, let's say, a heart attack or a stroke or some angina or something, they'll say, if you don't take statins, I can't take responsibility for your health. It is absolutely imperative that you do this. So why are the doctors so indoctrinated about this message? And I want to just say, this is from the British Medical Journal. This is from the stuff the doctors should read, but often it's not their fault. They don't have time to keep up with all the research. But this is, again, a big meta-analysis of this. And I want you to just have a number in your head. If you took statins, and these were, I think this was an average of 3.7 years, I think. So if you took statins for that long, you've already had a heart attack. And your doctor's saying, you must be on this stuff, otherwise, you know, you're on your own, buddy. So how much longer do you think you would live if you took statins? And I just want you to think of a number, you know, how many years or months or whatever. So the answer is this. This is what British Medical Journal found: 5 days. So that you've got $1 trillion industry based on the fact of making someone live probably in more discomfort because there are side effects for an extra 5 days. Does that really warrant the excessive use of them? I'm going to say no. If you haven't had any problems, then 3 days. So I just want to sort of highlight this as well, because we brought up fat a lot and saturated fat, and it's still the prevailing conventional wisdom that saturated fat is dangerous. They say it raises LDL cholesterol, which it does, but I'm going to, as I said earlier, you want your cholesterol, and in some way you want it to be high as well, because there is, well, I'll take you to the second of these studies from British Medical Journal. There was a 22% higher risk of death for each 0.78 millimole per litre reduction in serum cholesterol. So as your cholesterol goes down, your risk of death goes up. And there's, again, an inverse correlation as well, especially with Alzheimer's, very strong, because I said the brain is made a lot of fat and a lot of cholesterol. If you start lowering cholesterol, your brain's going to go wrong. And, you know, I think this is a really, really important message. And it's so sort of mired in history that we can't undo it. It's so entwined in our psyche that we can't undo this message. But I'm going to keep hammering on until I try and get people to do it. So that thing, again, BMJ up the top, saturated fats are not associated with all-cause mortality. In other words, your risk of dying from anything. They're not associated with increase in cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, stroke, or type 2 diabetes. And down the bottom, replacing saturated fat with kind of processed vegetable oils like margarine and stuff like that is unlikely to reduce cardiovascular events, basically, or total mortality. So all this stuff that's been going on since Procter & Gamble came out with that Cisco shortening in 1911 it's hype and it's marketing, and we need to get back to, I mean, if you've got in your fridge some lard and some butter and some coconut oil and some extra virgin olive oil to pour on your vegetables, you're doing the right stuff. Get rid of the margarine, because it doesn't do you any good whatsoever. So back to sort of blood pressure, back to some medications and interactions from that. So looking at blood pressure, some of the common side effects of these things: chronic dry cough, headaches, dizziness, loss of taste, weakness, swelling, blah, 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 kidney failure. That's one. This is another thing that is a diuretic, so it's used to reduce blood pressure as well. So gastrointestinal problems, kidney damage, lethargy, collapse, coma. It's not looking very good. So although drugs are supposed to be, well, they are really, well, I don't know, they're supposed to be released because they have a greater benefit over a risk. Here's all the risks. And if we've got, again, a disease which is caused by lifestyle, we just need to change our lifestyle. So then we've got these sort of modern diabetic medications, and the second paragraph there said basically this medication, it suppresses DPP4, which is an enzyme which in itself suppresses tumors. So if you've got cell overgrowth and you're on your way to cancer and you've got this enzyme shut off, which is supposed to be shutting the cancer down, you're in trouble. And you're not in trouble today, you're in trouble in 10 years' time. But as that says down the bottom, none of the safety studies on this drug addressed its impact on tumor growth prior to approval. So not even looking, or they're completely avoiding this. And this gets even scarier. So this is, again, diabetic medication, 43% increase of risk of heart attack, 64% higher risk of cardiovascular death. And this is hushed up. This fact, blah, 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 profoundly dangerous, a fact hidden by GSK for 10 years, as they knew it would adversely affect sales. And if you look at the bottom paragraph of there were many articles and reviews published about this following the New England Journal of Medicine study, but research from the Mayo Clinic revealed that 90% of scientists working on this and writing favorable articles on it had financial ties to the drug company producing it. It's a corrupt system. And if you haven't gathered that by now, sorry for getting so passionate about it, but I don't like people's health being bought and being mucked around with by greed. I think it's really ugly. So this is the chairman, the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, and she says it's basically no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that's published. And that's a sort of a really worrying message, isn't it? And I think that's the way I've heard this before, that if the doctors don't become nutritionists, nutritionists will become the doctors. And I'm not saying there's not there's room for a marriage. There's room for medical knowledge combined with nutritional knowledge. And that is a really holistic way to start looking at healthcare. So we need to take that medical knowledge, that sort of normal pharmacological knowledge, and combine it with lifestyle and nutritional knowledge, and then we get proper healthcare. So as I've intimated before, we can do something about it if we basically address our diet and exercise and nutrition in the right way. And I won't get too deep, there's not too much longer to go, I think. So drink a lot of water. I've cut down on caffeine if sensitive, but actually coffee is a massive source of antioxidants in the diet. It's much, much higher than fruit, gram for gram. So personally, I mean, there are genes concerned with whether you can process caffeine well or not, but it's actually it's a really good thing if you're not sensitive to it. And here's where sugar is hidden. And if you've watched any of Kat's little videos, you'll have seen her, going on about this very eloquently, because it's something that's very a passionate subject for both of us. Bottom right there, you can see, that's mango juice. So we've got fruit juice as being not a good way to stress. As I said before, that's all getting processed through your liver. That fructose is all going through your liver. So you're in big trouble if that's how you're drinking a lot. If a lot of your drinks are not water and herbal teas and things like that, but they're actually those kind of high sugar drinks. So How do you get around that? Do you get around it by having some Diet Coke or something like that? This is from the journal Physiological Behavior. Basically says that if you drink diet drinks, they educate your brain to not only to expect sugary stuff, so you're going to try and find that in other foodstuffs and drinks that you eat, but it also tricks the body, because the body thinks it's got sweetness and therefore it should be releasing insulin to cope with that sugar, whereas there's actually no sugar there. So it's releasing insulin, and then that insulin is going to work as a fat storage hormone, even in the absence of the calories coming in on that drink. So if you've just eaten, you know, let's say any meal, but you've washed it down with a 0-calorie drink, the insulin's getting switched on and you're into fat storage mode. So independent of the calories in that drink. So, and then, well, it says down the bottom, basically, I don't know how many people you've seen that drink diet drinks, but I've got one friend that's slim who does that, but he only has like one a week or something like that. But basically it encourages us to crave more sugars. So this is what we'll do. We're going to take you through this sort of in Kath's group. So basically about how you eat in a low glycemic way, healthy fat and protein sources, and how to eat at, well, you can see on the right, how good does that look? But this is basically good quality food, which is the right kind of balance of macronutrients. So the other bit of this I've mentioned already about exercise, but really important. Fitness levels are an accurate indicator of mortality. I've mentioned resistance training as being incredibly important. Build your engine, build that muscle. That muscle will help your posture, it improves immune function, it keeps you strong, obviously, and it keeps that weight training improves your bone density, and it stimulates your connective tissue. It does all the things that we associate with being young, basically. And frequency is more important than duration. So don't go once a week for 3 hours. Go 5 times a week for 20 minutes, and that would give you a greater benefit. Get off the scales, because it's more important what your body's made of than what it weighs. This is of the same woman, same weight, but you can see she's very clearly different metabolically, physiologically, anatomically, in one picture to the next. And the last thing I want to mention, but I'm not, because we're sort of, I'm just having a look at the time, I've spoken for too long already. So cellular nutrition and micronutrients, massively, massively important subject, but I haven't got time to go into it, which is why next Wednesday we will talk about that. But, you know, to give you one example from a million, so if you have an extra 10 micrograms of vitamin K2, you have a 7% reduction in your risk of developing type 2 diabetes. So I can find the study for that if you want it, but if you increase that by another 10, you've got a further 7% reduction. Increase it by another 10, you've got a further 7% reduction. That's vitamin K2. Now, where do you get that from? You basically get it from fat. So you get it from hard cheeses, you get it from animal fats. You don't really get that from vegetables. And yeah, that's, although you can do some conversion of K1 to K2, but anyway, when we're looking at that, really most people are deficient in that, but not only are they deficient in that, and don't go out and just buy K2 just because I've just mentioned it. It's part of, yeah, this, if you're looking at micronutrition, it needs to be a totally comprehensive approach, and that's what we're going to talk about next Wednesday. So with Syndrome X, as with every disease, if your cells are not receiving the nutrients on a cellular level that they need to function properly, they're going to be in trouble. So, and we're now looking at a new paradigm really in supplementation with micronutrients, where it's about triggering our mitochondria. I won't go into it now because I'll go into it next week, but triggering our mitochondria to renew themselves more efficiently and create energy more efficiently. And these are some of the things that will help that to happen. And it's a very carefully worked out science. And it triggers these genes which are associated with actually living longer. It's as simple as that. So the science is getting very, very strong on this stuff now, and reducing oxidative stress through extra sort of antioxidants and things like that. But it's about our body's capacity, our ability to make those antioxidants on the inside. It's not just about taking vitamin C and thinking you're covered. It's a much, much more complex and developed and nuanced subject than that. So again, we'll go into it next week. So a special mention again for omega-3s, and this slide, really important. You are what you absorb from what you eat has eaten. So that depends on our gut health, but it also depends whether the cow you're eating has been fed on grass or fed on grain. So when it's fed on grass, about 3% of its fat in its body is omega-3s, anti-inflammatory. And when you eat that, it's great for you as well. But what do farmers do when they want to sell their cows and take them to market? They basically feed them corn and beans and grains, and they fatten them up, and they want that cow to put on 100 pounds in the last 4 or 5 weeks of its life, and they do it by feeding it like that. And what happens to the omega-3s in the cow's tissue? It goes from 3% to 0. In 196 days it takes that to happen. So now you've got what was a kind of anti-inflammatory food turning into a pro-inflammatory food. Same food. So if you've got high omega-3s, your risk of heart disease, heart attacks goes down by a lot, 69%, if you can get your omega-3s in your red blood cells to go up to be more than 8%. It doesn't take that much to do that. So just a last little mention for training, and we can talk about this more in the group, is that when you train, do something you love. I hate running, but I love badminton, and I will chase a shuttlecock down for hours until I collapse in a kind of sweaty heap on the floor. But if you ask me to do that running, I'm not interested. So do something that you love, do it with friends, do it with people where you're kind of challenging each other. So you're accountable to each other. There's lots of ways to make that enjoyable and to have a real benefit. And I'll just say that, if anyone wants to ask me about sort of putting, a bit of help with an exercise program, I'm very, very happy to do that. Because it's very easy to get intimidated by the gym, by anything but a treadmill, and think, well, I've got these dumbbells, what do I do with them? And also it's kind of, it needs to be addressed carefully, but it needs to be addressed in an effective way, which is going to make a difference. So I wouldn't knock some of the meal replacements, partly because they're much more controlled sometimes than the actual food we're eating, where you've got, farmed salmon is now a dangerous food. And salmon, when I was a child, was great. So some companies produce some really good quality macronutrient options, which allow you to replace a meal or replace a snack very healthily, actually. Last slide, I think, is just some resources. I sort of mentioned a couple of books, the Patrick Holford book. There's some great things on YouTube. There's a fantastic thing. I mentioned the history of margarine. It's absolutely fascinating. It's a woman called Nina Teckholtz, and she wrote a thing called The Big Fat Surprise, and she goes into fat metabolism. If you're interested in the subject, there's just so much stuff out there, and if you want to ask us to point you in the direction, we can. But that cholesterol thing, if I've surprised you about cholesterol tonight, go and read that book, The Great Cholesterol Con by Dr. Malcolm Kendrick, or The Great Cholesterol Myth by Johnny Bowden, or look it up on YouTube or TED Talks or whatever. Supplements, we'll talk about them next week in greater detail. And that Encyclopedia for Natural Medicine, fantastic book by Michael Murray. So there's a few things, but again, in the group, you can just ask us if you're interested in a particular subject. So this is a spoof, but there's a lot of truth in it. And we've given up eating that, haven't we? But go and buy some lard tomorrow and stick it in your fridge and cook with it. It's fantastic. Okay, so with that, thank you from me. I'm going to hand you back to Kath, and stop my screen sharing now. And you're back on, Kath, I think.